Imagine living in a country where publishing a single highly critical sentence about the president could actually land you in a federal prison cell.
Right, and you aren't plotting a violent coup or anything. You're literally just writing an angry editorial.
Exactly. Now, you might picture a modern authoritarian regime, but that was actually the United States of America in 1798.
It is wild to think about.
It really is. Today, we are looking at how an entire nation went from throwing journalists in jail for insulting the government to building the most massive, chaotic, and frankly, completely overwhelming information ecosystem on the planet.
Yeah, and if you've ever scrolled through your feed and wondered, how the media landscape became so deeply fractured, well, we have the map.
We do. Our guide for this deep dive into the source material is Professor Dr. Milton Biswas and his book, America's Media Power, 250 Years.
It's a fantastic text.
It is. We're tracking the evolution of American media, starting with these ink-stained radical pamphlets trying to incite a rebellion, all the way to the bustling, sensational mass market of the penny press.
And Dr. Biswas makes this foundational argument early in the text that completely reorients how we should view this history.
Right.
He says the media in America has never been a passive mirror, just, innocently reflecting society. From its very inception, it has been an active, highly aggressive political actor molding public consciousness.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because to really understand the media's power, we have to start at the birth of the nation.
We do.
We are looking at the original viral media format that convinced colonists to actually risk their lives for a revolution. I am talking about the humble pamphlet.
Right, the pamphlet. And to grasp its impact, we really have to picture the media landscape of the 18th century.
Which is completely different.
Entirely different. European political thought at the time was dominated by dense aristocratic treatises. Think of massive, leather-bound volumes filled with really complex philosophical arguments.
Stuff it was incredibly expensive to print.
Exactly. Expensive, difficult to read, and aimed exclusively at a highly educated elite. The pamphlet flipped that dynamic entirely. They were cheap to produce, easy to carry around in a coat pocket, and written in plain, accessible language meant for the common person.
And the undisputed king of this format was Thomas Paine's Common Sense, published in January 1776. The scale of its reach is just mind-boggling when you look at the raw numbers.
Oh, it's staggering.
It sold between 100,000 and 500,000 copies. Today, 500,000 copies is a massive New York Times bestseller in a country of over 330 million people.
Right.
But back then, the entire population of the colonies was only about 2.5 million.
The market penetration was unprecedented. And what made it so effective was how it bypassed literacy barriers. Common Sense wasn't just consumed silently in wealthy parlors.
Right, people were reading it out loud.
Exactly. It was designed to be read aloud in taverns, town squares, and meeting houses. A single printed copy might reach 50 different people in a crowded room.
Wow.
Paine deliberately used analogies and biblical references that ordinary farmers and tradespeople would instantly understand. He made the argument for independence visceral rather than purely academic.
It feels like Common Sense was the 18th century equivalent of a perfectly crafted, viral social media thread.
That is a great way to put it.
Because he took this incredibly thorny geopolitical issue, breaking away from a global military superpower, and just distilled it into plain English.
Yeah, he attacked the absurdity of hereditary monarchy directly.
And by doing so, he completely bypassed the traditional elite gatekeepers. He didn't need the permission of the educated class to get his message straight to the masses.
What's fascinating here is how this forged what sociologists call a participatory public sphere.
Okay, what does that mean exactly?
Well, the media wasn't just delivering a top-down list of daily events from an authority figure. It was actively constructing a shared narrative of oppression and resistance. By gathering in a tavern, listening to the pamphlet being read, and then debating its merits over a pint of ale, ordinary colonists were transforming themselves.
They were actively participating.
Right. They were shedding their identities as passive subjects of the British Crown and becoming active, engaged citizens of this theoretical new republic.
And that shared sense of resistance is a powerful unifier when you have an external enemy like the King of England.
Oh, absolutely.
But once the revolution was actually won, the new nation faced the terrifying reality of having to govern itself. All those unified citizens suddenly had vastly different ideas about how the country should be run.
Yes, they did.
And the media transitioned almost overnight from a unifying revolutionary spark into a fiercely divided political weapon.
The shift is stark. If the pamphlet was about unity, the early newspaper was about internal factional warfare.
Like total chaos.
Pretty much. Let's look at the evolution. The very early papers, going back to the Boston Newsletter in 1704, were relatively tame. But by the time we get into the early days of the Republic, newspapers evolved into hyper-partisan battlegrounds.
I want to push back on the framing of that era as a negative thing, though. Because our modern assumption is that a biased press is inherently broken.
Sure, we idolize neutrality.
Exactly. We look at the gold standard of journalistic objectivity today and assume anything else is a failure. But honestly, wasn't that early system of unapologetically subsidized papers actually better for the reader in some ways?
How so?
Well, if Alexander Hamilton is funding a paper, you know exactly what his agenda is. The bias is entirely transparent, unlike today where political agendas are often hidden behind a fake veil of neutrality.
And that is a really fair point. Transparency was definitely a feature. But the sheer toxicity and instability it caused threatened to tear the fragile new government apart.
It was that bad.
It was vicious. You had powerful figures like Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson directly bankrolling rival newspapers to act as their political attack dogs.
Wow.
The rhetoric wasn't just polite policy disagreement. It was deeply personal invective and biting satire. The idea of a neutral press wouldn't take root for decades.
So they were basically political operatives.
Exactly. These partisan editors genuinely believed it was their democratic duty to obliterate their ideological opponents. They were deeply embedded in the very power struggles they were covering. Many of them held government positions or received lucrative government printing contracts at the exact same time.
It was literally a brawl in print. But the irony is that out of this chaotic, hyper-partisan brawl, we get the foundation for modern press freedom.
We do.
The source text dives into the 1734 trial of John Peter Zenger, which is just a perfect example of how the mechanics of media law began to shift.
Right. The Zenger trial is a cornerstone case.
Zenger was a printer in New York who aggressively criticized the colonial governor, William Cosby. And Cosby basically had him arrested and charged with seditious libel.
And the mechanics of that trial are crucial to understand. Under English common law at the time, truth was not a defense against libel.
Wait, really? So you could be arrested for telling the truth?
Yes. In fact, the legal standard was often the greater the truth, the greater the libel.
That is so backwards.
Well, their reasoning was that if you printed something negative and true about a powerful person, it was much more likely to cause public unrest or a breach of the peace than a blatant lie.
Oh, I see.
So the only question for the jury was whether Zenger had actually punted the papers, which he undeniably had.
Right. But Zenger's lawyer, Andrew Hamilton, steps in and makes this incredibly radical argument to the jury. He essentially tells them to ignore the letter of the law and look at the principle.
A huge risk.
Massive. He argues that citizens have a fundamental right to complain about the abuses of power, and therefore, if the statements printed are actually true, the publisher cannot be punished. And the jury actually acquits him.
It was a huge moment.
It established the radical precedent that truth is an absolute defense against libel. You can't be thrown in jail just because your factual reporting makes the government look incompetent.
And that acquittal elevated the press into a watchdog role. It gave them legal armor.
Yeah.
Armed with that protection, as we move into the 19th century, we see the rise of the true editorial voice.
Right, like Horace Greeley.
Exactly. Horace Greeley, who founded the New York Tribune. Editors began to blend basic reportage with overt, structured argumentation. They weren't just printing ship arrivals and commodity prices anymore. They were actively trying to guide public opinion on massive existential issues like westward expansion, labor rights, and eventually abolition.
But the press became so powerful and so heavily armed with these legal precedents that the government inevitably panicked. They realized they were losing control of the narrative.
They absolutely did.
And this sparks a massive collision between press freedom and state authority.
Right. So the First Amendment was ratified in 1791, providing an explicit revolutionary guarantee that Congress would make no law abridging the freedom of the press.
It's a huge deal.
But a mere 7 years later, the government tested that guarantee to its breaking point. In 1798, the United States was engaged in the quasi-war with France, and the political atmosphere was incredibly tense.
Super paranoid.
Yeah. President John Adams and his Federalist Party viewed the rival Republican press as a genuine threat to national security.
It's as if the Founding Fathers built a high-performance sports car, the free press. And then, almost the second they turned the key and heard the engine roar, they panicked and tried to install a speed governor.
That is exactly what happened. They were terrified of the machine they had just built.
And the speed governor was the Alien and Sedition Acts.
Precisely. The Sedition Act specifically criminalized the publishing of false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the government or the president with the intent to defame them.
And this wasn't just an idle threat on paper.
No, it was weaponized directly against opposition journalists. Benjamin Franklin Bash, the editor of the Philadelphia Aurora and a fierce critic of the Adams administration, was arrested.
Wow.
The state used its coercive power to try and crush dissenting media, proving that the words of the First Amendment weren't a magical shield.
And Dr. Biswas points out that this reflex to silence the press wasn't just an 18th century hiccup. It's a recurring theme whenever the state feels threatened.
Unfortunately, yes.
Fast forward to the 20th century, during the height of World War I and the subsequent Red Scare. The Supreme Court case, Schenck v. United States in 1919, perfectly illustrates this. Charles Schenck was distributing leaflets urging young men to resist the military draft.
And the government arrested him under the Espionage Act.
Right.
The Supreme Court upheld Schenck's conviction, and Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. introduced the famous clear and present danger test.
The whole yelling fire in a theater thing.
Exactly. He argued that the First Amendment doesn't protect a man falsely shouting fire in a crowded theater and causing a panic. The precedent was set that during wartime, utterances that are perfectly tolerable in times of peace can be punished.
Which is pretty scary.
It is. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it reveals that press freedom is never a static, absolute gift. It is a highly fragile boundary that requires constant negotiation.
So it's an ongoing struggle.
Yes. The media and the government are locked in a perpetual tug of war. Whenever there is a national security crisis, domestic unrest, or profound political instability, the state's immediate instinct is to pull that line backward and restrict the flow of information.
Wow. Okay, so while the government and the press were fighting these massive battles in the courtrooms, a much quieter but arguably more profound revolution was happening in the background.
A technological revolution.
Yeah. The actual physical medium of print was changing, and the economics of producing it were plummeting. This shift didn't just change the news. It fundamentally changed what it meant to be an American.
The text introduces the sociologist Benedict Anderson and his theory of imagined communities to explain this phenomenon.
Right.
Anderson argued that a nation isn't just a geographical space drawn on a map. A nation is a socially constructed community. Millions of people who will never meet each other, who live thousands of miles apart, somehow feel a deep, inherent kinship.
And print capitalism was the engine that built that kinship in the United States. Try to conceptualize how strange and wonderful that actually is. You know you are part of a country, not because you know everyone in it, but simply because you and a farmer in Ohio and a merchant in Boston are all reading the exact same story about the frontier on the exact same day.
Right. You are participating in a synchronized civic ritual.
And the technological leaps made that synchronization possible. For a long time, paper was made from linen and cotton rags, which was this expensive, labor-intensive process.
Right.
But the transition to cheap wood pulp paper, combined with steam-powered cylinder printing presses, completely democratized reading.
We changed everything.
Books, magazines, and newspapers were no longer luxury items. The market exploded with serialized fiction, poetry, cultural criticism, and influential magazines like the Atlantic Monthly, which was founded in 1857.
And this shared media diet was building the foundational mythologies of the country. Through these pages, the entire nation was collectively defining the spirit of liberty, the romanticism of the Western frontier, and the concept of the melting pot.
But the source material points out a crucial paradox in this era, doesn't it?
It does. Mass print culture undeniably consolidated a unified national identity. However, because the technology lowered the barrier to entry so dramatically, it also gave a megaphone to marginalized groups.
That is incredible.
Yeah. Abolitionists like Frederick Douglass with the North Star, early feminists fighting for suffrage, and immigrant communities printing papers in their native languages, they all utilized cheap print to share their own narratives.
So print capitalism unified the nation,
Yeah.
but it also prevented the media from ever becoming a singular, monolithic tool of cultural control by the elite.
Precisely. The imagined community was always a contested space of competing visions.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Because as broad as this shared literary culture was becoming, it was still largely tailored for the middle class and the elite who had the time and money for annual subscriptions.
True.
That is, until a sudden economic innovation in the bustling cities turned the news into a daily disposable product for absolutely everyone. Enter the penny press.
The pivot happens in 1833. A young printer named Benjamin Day launches the New York Sun.
And he breaks all the established rules of publishing.
He does. He drops the price of his newspaper from the standard 6 cents down to just 1 single penny.
Going from 6 cents to 1 cent is a staggering 83% price cut.
Huge.
And by making it that cheap, Day completely changed the target demographic of journalism. He wasn't aiming at affluent merchants or political insiders reading in quiet parlors anymore.
No.
He was targeting the booming, chaotic, incredibly diverse urban working class and the massive waves of immigrants filling the city's streets.
And the mechanism behind this shift is the true revolution. To survive while only charging 1 cent, you can't rely on expensive long-term subscriptions.
Right.
And you certainly can't rely on the old model of political party patronage. Day completely flipped the revenue model.
He needed ads.
Exactly. The new financial lifeblood was mass advertising, but advertisers only pay if you can guarantee them a massive audience. You need raw eyeballs.
So the actual content of the paper had to change drastically to capture and hold that massive audience. The dense, boring political speeches and international shipping manifests were just thrown out the window.
Nobody wanted to read that.
Exactly. In their place, the penny press gave the working class crime reports, local gossip, sensationalized human interest stories, and outright entertainment.
The penny press essentially redefined what news was. It seeded the tactics that would eventually explode into the yellow journalism circulation wars of the 1890s between publishers like Hearst and Pulitzer.
Wow.
To constantly feed this machine with local stories, newspapers had to invent on-the-ground beat reporting. They created police reporters.
They literally had to find the drama.
Exactly. They broke the dense walls of text into segmented columns with massive, eye-catching headlines designed to grab your attention instantly. And they didn't wait for the mail delivery. They used street hawkers and newsboys shouting those headlines on street corners to drive impulse buys.
Consuming the news became a loud, daily, unavoidable urban ritual.
It really did.
It's basically the 19th century version of the smartphone invention. Think about the parallel. Suddenly, absolutely everyone has cheap, instant access to the information stream.
That's a great comparison.
And the moment that happens, the content pivots. It becomes about catchy headlines, sensational gossip, and engagement-driven narratives designed to capture mass attention. The penny press figured out that human drama sells way faster than political theory.
And this raises an important question, and it's the exact same tension we wrestle with today.
Yeah.
The penny press undeniably democratized information. It empowered the working class by giving them a public sphere they could actually afford to participate in.
Which is a good thing.
It is. But it also introduced the profound ethical quandaries of commodifying the news. When your survival depends purely on mass circulation and advertising revenue, there is an overwhelming structural temptation to prioritize entertainment, shock value, and sensationalism over deep, factual, necessary information.
So what does this all mean? When we trace this incredible 250-year journey mapped out by Dr. Biswas, the through line is just astonishing.
It really puts things into perspective.
We started with radical, plain-spoken pamphlets designed to overthrow a king. We watched those evolve into highly toxic, hyper-partisan newspapers fighting political brawls, which resulted in legal protections like the Zinger trial and massive legal crackdowns like the Sedition Acts.
Yep.
We saw the rise of cheap wood pulp paper build an imagined national community. And finally, we saw 1-cent papers fighting for ad revenue on bustling city streets by selling crime and gossip.
Every step of the way, the media wasn't just reporting on America. It was actively building the nation, shaping its laws, and defining its culture.
Exactly.
The media ecosystem we find so overwhelming, loud, and chaotic today wasn't an accident. It was built layer by layer over centuries, driven by the exact same human desires for community connection, political power, and commercial success that drove Thomas Paine and Benjamin Day.
Which brings me to a final thought, something I want you to mull over after we wrap up here. It builds directly on Benedict Anderson's theory of imagined communities that we explored earlier.
Oh, this is a great point.
If the original concept of America was built by millions of strangers, reading the exact same newspapers, the same serialized stories, and the same magazines at the exact same time, well, what happens to our shared national identity today?
Yeah.
Because when you open your phone and scroll through your feed, highly personalized algorithms ensure that you and your neighbor almost never read the same things at the same time anymore. If we are no longer sharing the same stories,
Hmm.
what kind of community are we imagining now?